This video is brought to you by Ground News. For the best part of a century, the US dollar has been the world's dominant reserve currency. Despite recurring talks of de-dollarisation, the dollar's share of global reserves has remained relatively steady for decades, and US treasuries are the backbone of the global financial system. However, Trump and his team seem set on testing the dollar's dominance to its limits, borrowing more and more money, and apparently even flirting with a so-called reprofiling or outright default. So in this video, we're going to take another look at the US dollar, and why some people think its status as the world's reserve currency could finally be coming to an end. Who's more influential, Trump or Putin? Well, we asked the TLDR team and audience to rank a bunch of powerful people, and we have the results. Find out the full list in the next copy of our magazine, Too Long. Pre-order a copy by clicking the link in the description. So, to understand this story, you need to understand the central role that the US dollar plays as the world's so-called reserve currency. Technically, a reserve currency is just that, a currency that central banks and other big financial institutions like to hold in their foreign exchange reserves. This is usually because these currencies are considered particularly safe, in that their value will remain relatively stable and that they can reliably be used to buy other things. There have been various different reserve currencies throughout history. In the 19th century, for instance, the pound was arguably the world's reserve currency, but since at least the end of World War II, the US dollar has been the world's dominant reserve currency, accounting for more than half of all reserves. The dollar's reserve status has its origins in the Bretton Woods system, which was negotiated after World War II and lasted until the so-called Nixon shock in the early 1970s. After the war, the Americans decided they wanted the dollar to be the centre of the new international monetary order, and so demanded that the dollar be the only currency that could be directly converted into gold, with all other major currencies then pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates. This is what originally made the dollar the world's most popular reserve currency, but its status persisted after then-President Richard Nixon ditched the gold standard in the early 1970s, because by then the dollar was already established as a popular global currency, and the US was the biggest economy in the world. Today this is still the case, and about half of all international transactions, including the majority of oil and commodity purchases, are denominated in dollars. Unsurprisingly, this means that dollars are accepted as legitimate currency basically everywhere, which is why people usually want dollars in times of crisis. Now, one of the key things to understand here is that the dollar's reserve status is today intimately tied up with the role that US government bonds, otherwise known as treasuries, play in the global financial system. Basically, in sort of the same way that the dollar is the world's favourite reserve currency, treasuries are the world's favourite form of debt. Not only does this allow the federal government to borrow tons of money, it also means that treasuries are essentially the basis of the entire global financial system. So if the treasury market breaks, everything else breaks as well. However, over the past few years, we've seen more and more talk of de-dollarisation. In other words, the erosion of the dollar's reserve status. To speak plainly, most of this talk has been nonsense. Every so often you see a headline about a new BRICS currency, or some middle power like the Saudis or Brazil moving to ditch the dollar, but these headlines have been popping up intermittently since literally the 70s, and they're almost always hot air, which is why the dollar's share of reserves has remained relatively steady for the past few decades. Nonetheless, in the past few months or so, there's been some more substantive anxiety that Trump's policies could actually erode the dollar's reserve status. And the fact the dollar declined at the same time as the stock market earlier this month will have provoked some anxiety in the Treasury. This doesn't usually happen. In fact, during stock market corrections, the dollar normally surges as investors look to it as a safe asset. Similarly, the concurrent rise in gold also suggests that the market no longer see the dollar as quite the safe haven asset it used to be. So, what's apparently eroding the dollar's reserve status? Well, there are at least 5 possible reasons. First, America's economy is flirting with recession, as Trump's unpredictable tariff regime shakes business and consumer confidence. Second, Trump and his team have said that they want to somehow devalue the dollar to help America reindustrialize, which has understandably spooked dollar holders, although how Trump squares this with his insistence that the dollar remains the world's reserve currency is unclear. Third, Trump's antagonistic attitude to America's long-standing allies. One of the reasons that the dollar is the world's reserve currency is that countries generally feel more comfortable holding their allies' assets. As a Fed staffer paper concluded, around 3/4 of foreign government holdings of safe US assets are by countries with some military tie to the US. As Trump withdraws those military guarantees, these countries will probably de-dollarize to an extent. Fourth, Trump's enthusiasm for sanctions. While Trump has previously acknowledged the risk that excessive use of sanctions could pose to the dollar's reserve status, after all, people don't want to hold dollars if they think that the US could just seize them on a whim. Now that he's in office, he's already proven pretty keen on them, whacking fresh sanctions on Venezuela, Iran, and China. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the US is issuing obscene amounts of debt. The US was already running a pretty enormous deficit when Trump came in, but his program of tax cuts, plus the fact that Doge now looks unlikely to make a dent in the federal budget, means that the deficit will probably increase in the near future. This has sparked some anxiety about the possibility of the US just defaulting on its massive debt pile, which would ruin confidence in both treasuries and the dollar. Things haven't been helped here by recent reports that Trump's Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and his chair of the Council of Economic Advisers Stephen Moran are considering bullying foreign investors into accepting a so-called reprofiling of their Treasury holdings. In other words, the US could tell countries like Japan, we won't protect you anymore unless you accept a delay in the payment on the money you lent us. There's even been some talk of converting foreign treasuries into so-called perpetual bonds. In other words, bonds with no set date for repayment. Obviously, this would massively undermine investor confidence in treasuries. Now, the big caveat here is that, well, for the dollar to lose its status as the world's reserve currency, something else needs to replace it. This has always been the issue for de-dollarisation advocates. There's no obvious alternative, and it's hard to see one emerging anytime soon. In related news, this story about Bessent acknowledging the heightened risk of a recession has been covered by more than 80 sources. Interestingly, we know that more than 10 of these have been reported by the left, and more than 19 of these have been reported by the right. That's because this week's sponsor, Ground News, are experts on pulling back the curtain on media bias. Built by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news, they ingest over 50,000 articles from all over the world, and then organise each by story. For each and every story, you can see the number of reporting sources, where these sources lead on the political spectrum at an individual level and group level, compare the headlines of each source, and read each article all without ever leaving the app. But one of the best parts of the app is their comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in left-leaning and right-leaning reporting. For example, for this story, left-leaning outlets tended to focus on the recessionary risk of Trump's tariff regime, while right-leaning outlets focused on the risks left over by the Biden administration, including the massive federal deficit. Ground News is such a useful tool for our current media landscape, and I think an app like this will only become more essential as the media landscape continues to evolve. If you're interested in everything that Ground News has to offer, you can get 40% off the Unlimited Access Vantage plan using the link in the description or by scanning the QR code. This offer is only available here, so make sure you go to ground.news/TLDR or click the link in the description to get started and support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent.